Oh, 23 minutes away from 9 o'clock. Good to have you with us here on the South African Morning. The ANC Policy Conference edition, day one, set to get underway in a couple of minutes from now. The formal program expected to start just after 9 o'clock. Not sure if there's any delays as yet. We haven't been told of any delays, but of course we'll continue our coverage throughout the day here at the Nasrec Expo Centre. Let's move away, though, from the policy conference for the moment and talk agriculture. Let's throw some numbers at you. The agricultural sector expected to fall by between 3 to 5%. While it does sound like it's bad news, the agricultural sector during COVID-19 was one of the sectors that actually did rather well. Let's get the reaction and the thoughts then of Nedbank's John Hudson joining us to talk about the mitigation of the contraction in the livestock sector as well. John, good to have you on eNCA. I hope you can hear me okay. So 3 to 5% expected the drop, but I think we need to be fair about this. It's coming off a high base. So how are we feeling about this contraction? Good morning.
Thank you, Gareth, and yes, good morning. So that 3 to 5% contraction does seem to be bad news, but as you've pointed out, it's actually off a high base. So I think if we do look at the past 2 years and the growth in the sector, if you look at it in that context, it really is still a very good performance. So I think 3 to 5% down on the face of it, might not look great, but really the sector's still doing well.
It certainly is, and the reports I saw earlier in the week as well, two particular products that are not just doing well at the moment. John, tell me if I'm right or wrong, but probably going to improve: soybean and sunflower. Why is it that those two, there's an expectation of improvement?
Well, Gareth, I think what we need to look at is that there's a multitude of factors or challenges facing the sector. It really is quite difficult to read, what is doing well and what is going to do well going forward. So I think certainly what has come to the fore is that the challenges, and it's almost, I suppose, an overhang of COVID-19. World supply chains, are really continue to be problematic. And so I think that is still a factor, and that is driving certain things. So we see that food costs, in certain items, like you mentioned, sunflower oil, for example, wheat is another. So if you look at the Russia and also Ukraine crisis, that is, I think, elevated or compounded some of the problems that we're facing, and has driven up certain costs. And mind you, if we're looking at certain food items, yes, wheat, sunflower oil, etc., but what I must also point out is that just the increase in input costs that is flowing through into, and that's driving farmers' costs as well. So we are seeing food inflation picking up. It has picked up over the last few months. It's expected to peak, around 10% in July, and thereafter sort of moderate towards year end with an average of 7% for the year. So I don't think it's all bad news for the consumer. Certain sectors, as you've said, grains and also oil seeds are still seeing sort of elevated prices. But quite frankly, if you look at South Africa and if you look at our food inflation, yes, it has risen. But if you take that and you compare that to the rest of the world, there are certain countries, and some of them are first world countries like the EU, where food inflation is in fact higher than 10%. So, I think it comes back to a strong South African sector, and that is really important in times of crisis. And so while you see a lot of volatility, a lot of uncertainty, I think it's still not bad news. As I said at the outset, 3 to 5% down in terms of the GDP, but overall the sector is doing okay.
So as the National Head of Agriculture, I don't want to drag you into the world of politics too heavily, John, but we do need to talk about it. If the sector is doing quite well, even though the decline of the back of a high base, when could we start seeing the price of food in general, the price of agricultural products coming down? Because a 350 Rand social relief grant doesn't get you much food these days. What's your expectation on pricing?
Well, just to mention two things. if I look at the, just take a bit of a forward-looking view, I still think we're in for a very tough time. You know, I've mentioned some of the pressures coming through, but quite honestly, two of the biggest pressures that we're sitting with currently is logistics and also market access. And now why I'm mentioning that is that those two factors could still have quite a bearing on food prices and also obviously prices for farmers. So those are two important things to keep in mind. But I almost sense that the worst is behind us from the pressure of sort of input costs, etc. So we're starting to see fertilizer and so on. It's starting to come off, which is really good news. And so I do feel that in the second 6 months of the year, we will see a fall in food prices. I think we're going to see a softening in some of those high commodity prices. So if you look at maize, for example, which is a staple diet, I think that's good news. And as I've said, food inflation is probably going to peak at 10%, but quite honestly, we do think it's going to moderate and maybe average 7% for the year. Now, that's still quite high, and I think the concern is not at a national food security level. We do, well as a country, we produce more than enough food, but it is at household food security, and that's a concern for me. There is going to be pressure coming through, and even at 7%, you would argue, given the pressures we face, jobs, unemployment, etc., it's going to continue to be an issue for the rest of the year.
It's a real shame as well, but it looks like there might at least be some light at the end of the tunnel. The problem is right now, John Hudson, is that the tunnel is very, very long indeed. Appreciate your time, John. Always good speaking to you. Nedbank National Head of Agriculture, just giving us a sense of what those food prices could look like for the rest of the year. So pressure still on consumers, at least for the rest of 2022.